Hey, man, I don't know how clear I was when I started this show and talking about our conversation. It's just kind of two guys talking about the business, and we're going to filter in some questions that I pulled off my website that people wanted to ask you. But this conversation is just about everything. And like if you and me were riding down the road together, and this is the kind of stuff that we would be talking about, I got to tell you that I've probably never heard enough stories about the dungeon. And I was reading some more articles about you before we talked, and your dad putting you in so many holes down there, and teaching you the business, teaching you respect. What was the atmosphere, the vibe like? Because the stories that were going around was just people screaming and being stretched and punished. What was the dungeon all about?
It was just a little tiny room. Really wasn't that big of a room. It was a little cement room, and then they put some boards around it so you could run into the boards, which are a little softer. They were sort of cushioned boards. And then but there was no ropes. And there was a mat that was as hard as a floor. There was hardly any give to it at all. In fact, it had boards going all the way across it. There was a little bit of padding, not very good padding, and some kind of canvas, and it was stretched out over the mat. It was actually probably a pretty good amateur wrestling mat, but it was not necessarily a good bump. But it had a low ceiling, had two windows where you could kind of peek in, and which were usually broken from baseballs and stuff like that. But then, the things that happened, then there was a whole weight room with everything. My dad mostly hand-built weights, but he did order some special weights that had the heart engraved into the side of the weights and stuff. They had some really nice chrome weights that were sort of new for that time period,
But your dad wasn't down there teaching chain wrestling. He was teaching wrestling holds and respect.
Well, you know what it was he loved wrestling. He was more of his whole thing was he loved to shoot wrestling. He'd wrestle, he'd go down there and he'd have whatever guys were working up here, they would come up on weekends when business was good in the 50s. All the wrestlers would sort of party at my dad's house, and you'd have a beer and hot dogs and barbecue and stuff like that. And they'd have a big barbecue, and Stu would make beer down in his basement, and they'd all drink beer and wrestle all day down long in the gym. The wrestlers would just kind of shoot with each other, pull necks, they used to call it. I can remember being about 3 or 4 years old and walking around down there with all these huge legs, like weightlifters, usually big, huge, heavy legs.
Yeah.
Guys squatting and stuff like that. Guys like Mike Sharp's dad. I can remember a lot of the guys from those days. But anyway, there's a lot of people up there, wrestling around on the mat. Bulldog Brower was a guy that was around in those days. I remember him. And that's probably about 1960 when I was about 3 years old, when I could probably start remembering them a little bit. And you just be around them. I just was always comfortable being around wrestlers. They often drove up to my parents' house on like if they got their check on Friday, if they needed it early for something, they'd drive up and get it and pick it up. And my mom was always that was one of the funny things about my dad's house was the office was right upstairs. So my mom was always like doing all the work in the office. My dad would be downstairs stretching guys in the basement. And you could hear these bellowing and screaming and these groans coming from the basement all the time for hours. And I'd bring a friend over to the house, and we'd just go upstairs to play pool or something. And you hear all these groans. It was like a haunted house or a torture chamber. And people be looking at you. There was a story about my mom one time that she heard when she wasn't accustomed to Stu stretching guys in the basement, and this must have been before I was born. But she ended up phoning the police because she heard all the screaming and stuff that coming out of the basement. And how the basement came into being what it was in the early 50s. Stu had good connections with the New York territory because he worked there with Toots Mondt and all that. And he was able to get a lot of the champions to come up to work up in Calgary for the Stampede and different things and bring them up to these big shows. And wrestling started to take off with television in those days. And Stu was one of the first guys to get wrestling on TV. And my dad ran wrestling like you dream it. It was like this great dream for all these wrestlers. And, they're all guys that he hired, and they were running around the country, and wrestling was super popular, and wrestling became popular, and they bought an airplane. The guys that used to work my dad's territory in the 50s used to fly to the towns. You know, it was like a whole different world. And, you know, by the time I was born, wrestling changed, and wrestling had lost some of its glamour. It was kind of getting kind of old. There was baseball and all kinds of stuff on TV now. And, you know, but when my dad would get calls from guys, they'd, you know, someone like Vern Gagne would call up and he goes, I got this guy that's you know, he's a football player, but I don't know if he's got what it takes, or so I'm going to send him up to Stu.
But was it just the football players for Stu to stretch, or was it accomplished guys coming in there to learn some more stuff to put in their arsenal? Because I'm thinking it's purely submission holds, and how much of that, you know, are they going to actually use in the squared circle?
Well, you know, like I said, a lot of times they just bowled around. You know, he was like
right.
Everybody took on everybody, and he had about 10 guys up there learning. You know, there'd be a couple that are football players, and there'd be a couple that are, you know, that are not, you know, they're just big farm kids, or, you know, he but generally looked for guys that, and got reference. Like the guys that ended up here were guys that somebody had said, hey, check out Stu Hart in Calgary. He'll teach you how to be a wrestler.
What kind of come-to-Jesus meeting was it for these football players who think they're all that in a bag of chips? And I got a lot of respect for football players, but, mister, when you take that knowledge and put it in there with a shooter, and you're in that world, tough day at the office. How'd the football players make out?
Well, you know, a lot of guys, if you look back on those days, like Wilbur Snyder and Gene Kaniski and Ernie Ladd, and there's quite a few guys that were football players that got into wrestling and did quite well. And I think it's an easy, you know, they're comparable to each other. It's a good big man sport, wrestling is, for someone that gets, especially if you had to leave football because of an injury or whatever. You still got the, you know, the basics. Wrestling's a perfect thing for somebody because it's a lot of the same movement as a football player. Same kind of running, the same kind of physical contact.
What kind of stuff was your dad telling you? Like if he had you in a submission hold and he was stretching you, what was he telling you while he was doing that?
Well, you know, there's a lot of people like to describe my dad as a guy that just always tortured guys, you know, but the reality and the honest truth of it is that he never was like that at all. And he was generally a guy that he was so passionate about it. He really loved teaching anybody that would just want to learn. You could stop him anywhere, on a bus, anywhere, or an airplane, getting, you know, as long as you wanted to know how it worked for real, he would love to show you.
Do you think
he loved a good student? If someone that he started to show you how to, you know, bend somebody and bend them up into a pretzel, and he's giving you sort of the fine points and how to get the guy's arm to sweep across this way or whatever. All these little fine tuning little tricks that he used to have. If you took an interest in it, you could talk. He'd talk you till your ear was off. He'd talk you for days about it until you know. He was like that was what he loved to do. That's where he really loved to do more than anything in the world, was teach you submission wrestling. Anyone that was interested, especially big men. He loved to make a big tough guy even tougher and maybe even more. You know, just you know, he wanted to make you that much more invincible.
But obviously that had a lot to do with your work style in the ring.